First of all, I'd like to thank the Faculty of Education for this invitation, this very, very warm invitation. It's a real honor and privilege to be here, and I have lots of friends and colleagues in the audiences, so this is kind of like my second home as well, so thank you again for that. I'd like to reiterate what Celia started off her talk with again today, especially when we're talking about the shifting landscapes of education. So before even beginning, once more, if I may, I'd like to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded Aboriginal territories of the Ojibwe and Anishinaabe people, and in particular the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation on whose territory we stand. And since we're dealing with the question of landscape, I thought it's important to reiterate this point again. So the theme of this year's event is shifting landscapes of education. The concept of education is an interesting one that can be interpreted in multiple ways, as we've seen and heard from the panel. As a critical and heuristic term, and very much a geographical one and political one, it can be interpreted in quite broadly. For instance, through three, and I'd like to say overlapping dimensions. First, a material dimension. Second, an imaginative dimension. And third, a political and radical dimension. I'd like to premise my comments with short reflections on each, as these are the themes that run very much through all the discussions today, and I think it weaves all the thoughts and the comments that have been made quite nicely. So first, the material base of a landscape of education is often closely aligned with the political economy of the educational environment that you alluded to right now, and would include the physical built form of a community or locality, the actual bricks and mortar of schools, the conditions and infrastructure of roads linking libraries, parks, housing, conditions, etc., the kind of extracurricular activities that you were referring to historically, but these sorts of communities of associations and linkages. So these landscapes do not exist in isolation, but are constituted by histories of capitalism, imperialism, patriarchy, racism, and other forms of oppression that have led to systemic inequities in the system that are spatially bound as well. These cartographies of schooling and education are reflexive landscapes of, as we've again heard Warren's paper and others, spatial segregation, down spatial on cosmopolitanism, social polarization and uneven development, which have been further accentuated through the project of neoliberalism and cutbacks and retrenchment in the system itself. So these are very much materially based, spatially bound, and physically present. Hence, we cannot understand these material landscapes in the absence of such power differentials, or what Doreen Massey defines as power geometries. And Nancy, you've talked about some through, Jens, you've talked about through some of your work on top of these kinds of power geometries as well, and the issues of inclusion and exclusion through your stories. Second, the imaginative landscape of education flows through many of these papers as well. The imaginative landscape of education, different from the material base of landscapes of education, but overlapping again, incorporates our collective imaginations, memories, and desires that we envision in and for educational landscapes. Educational landscapes are institutional habitats where we've heard the stories today, and I'm sure there'll be more stories on this, where loss, joy, pain, and hope have deeper experiential and collective meanings, where social and emotional relations are cultivated, where violence, love, belonging, and exile create communities of inclusion and exclusion, simultaneously allowing for learning and scholarship to thrive or even shrivel away, where the oppressor and the oppressed, the colonial and the subaltern, the displaced and the settled coexist side by side and are constantly redefining, subverting, or challenging imaginative and representative landscapes that you've all pointed out. Finally, the political radical landscape of education, which is something maybe if you've had a chance to maybe finally comment a little bit more on. You've alluded to it slightly, but this is something you might want to comment on at the end. So the political and radical landscape of education, aside from the material and the imaginative landscape, allows for transformation and change, not in a reformist patchwork way, but in a radical form that digs deep into histories and structural impediments, Power is not dismissed, but crucial in the intersectional analysis of class, race, gender divides that have been part of the unpleasant educational histories of subjugation and humiliation. So how does it work, for instance, in the pedagogies of even technological pedagogies? How does this work through that? This is the landscape of anti-oppression that is grounded in multi-scalar networks of alliances, support, and activism. This is the landscape of education that acknowledges the violence, the genocide, and corresponding ethical demands and rights. For example, from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, what we're seeing in Toronto right now, the Black Lives Matter, the LGBTQ2, and the refugee crisis that is very, very much present in our city today. An educational landscape that is in need of constant introspection and interrogation and constant reinterrogation in order to create a socially just and equitable society. And I think the 5 papers today have very nicely covered one aspect or the other of these educational landscapes through their various dimensions. A common theme that Warren's paper on Baldwin and Carter talks about the places and landscapes visited, the disappearance and the appearance through this kind of imagination of the school beyond the local beyond. And so it takes that other kind of imagination and memory into account. And so Baldwin and Carter's stories are interesting to rethink these kinds of different types of memories of landscape and how we might think through that again today. Jen's paper, if I might call you Jen, empowering yet talks about the empowering yet the very complicated stories of these individuals, the courageous stories that they bring about to their collective memories, through their collective experience, the pain, the anxiety, yet the empowerment that they share with us, asks us and urges us to rethink about education in a much more radical way than we should. Michelle, your paper talks about a different kind of relational landscape as one that is shaped and in terms shapes and in terms is shaped by different kinds of processes. The material is certainly there, but you've got the other kind of space that is present and absent also, unlike the others, but also has a material and a virtual space. So this kind of virtuality allows for communities to come together in different kinds of discourses and languages together. So that kind of articulation allows for a pedagogy to be rethought in different ways. And then as someone who's beginning to use Twitter very much and beginning to form different kinds of communities, not only nationally, but also internationally, and so thinking about landscapes of radical movements in a much more, sort of spread way. So what does that mean in terms of pedagogy? And Teresa, your work is in terms of, the rationalization of neoliberalism, in terms of how we rethink of the welfare state, the retrenchment and what that has caused in terms of the everydayness in the schools, the cutbacks or in the university, and the cutbacks that have affected day-to-day the learning experience. And so that very much has to be negotiated and is constantly evolving and shifting over time. And space, and you mentioned the regional dynamics of it. I mean, space, the spaces of education, both at the very, very local level, the regional level, and the provincial level, all are very, very political. Yes. And shifts depending on that particular perspective. And Dan's a project on cosmopolitanism and questions that need to, and he urges us to really seriously reconsider how we question our assumptions and how to trouble the landscape with different kinds, alternative kinds of understandings, to take our understandings outside the box, to rethink how we, particularly living in Toronto, think about questions of living in a very kind of cosmopolitan landscape, and what I like the term is also subaltern cosmopolitanism that all of us have been, all of us and many in the room I'm sure are dealing with in their work, but also to think about new ways of being, as you talked about, how our places of belonging formed and contested. So these are the common themes that I see, and I very much appreciate learning from all of you. So I guess that's it.